In the quiet, picturesque city of Geneva, a chilling story unfolded. On a cold October night in 1759, the body of Antoinette Martin, a young woman, was discovered in her home. The cause of death was a self-inflicted wound, a stark contrast to the peaceful image of the city. Her death sent shockwaves through the community, drawing international attention. Her sister, the Countess d'Allegren, living in France, wrote to Sire Jean-François Salon, a banker and de facto ambassador for the Genevan Republic in Paris, demanding answers. The investigation revealed a life of luxury and prosperity for her husband Antoine Laurent, who just 16 months later died of natural causes. The stark difference in their fates raised more questions than it answered. This is not an isolated incident. In the late 18th century, Geneva, like many other European cities, saw a surge in suicides. But why? To understand this, we need to delve into the cultural dimensions of suicide, particularly the roles of marriage, love, and the family. In the early modern period, marriage and family ties were seen as crucial safeguards against suicide. Emile Durkheim, a pioneering sociologist, argued that strong family bonds provided emotional support and a sense of belonging, reducing the risk of suicide. However, the reality was more complex, especially in a city like Geneva where social and economic changes were reshaping people's lives. During this period, romantic love began to play a more significant role in marriage. Unlike the arranged marriages of the past, people started to marry for love, leading to closer emotional ties within families. This shift, however, also brought new challenges. Women in particular faced unique pressures. If a couple had a serious conflict, a woman might make a half-hearted suicide attempt to pressure her male partner to change his behavior. These attempts were often less serious and less reported than those of men who were more likely to commit murder, completed suicide, or murder-suicide in response to conflicts. Alcohol played a significant role in the lives of many who struggled. In the late 20th century, studies showed that alcoholics made up 30% of suicides in the United States, despite comprising only 5% of the general population. In 18th century France, while the elites often complained about the drunkenness of the lower classes, evidence suggests that these concerns were sometimes exaggerated. The economic landscape of Geneva also influenced suicide rates. By the late 18th century, women were increasingly involved in the watchmaking industry, comprising 16% of the workforce in 1788 and 30% by 1798. Despite their contributions, women were poorly paid, especially for the delicate tasks they performed. This economic disparity added to the stress and frustration many women felt. The city's authorities took suicide seriously, subjecting attempted suicides to criminal investigation and penalties. However, the records show that only 35 unsuccessful suicide attempts were investigated over a 250-year period, involving 25 men and 10 women. This suggests that many attempts went unreported, making it difficult to fully understand the scope of the problem. Marriage and family status played a crucial role in the likelihood of suicide. Single people were overrepresented among suicides, while married individuals were underrepresented. This aligns with Durkheim's theory that marriage provides protection against suicide by offering integration and regulation. However, the data from Geneva shows that marriage offered equal protection to both men and women. The largest category of suicides was those who had never married, indicating that marriage was indeed a significant factor in reducing the risk of suicide. Widowhood presented a particularly challenging situation. Widows and widowers were overrepresented among suicides, with widows being 3 times more numerous than widowers in the population. The average age of widowed suicides was 57.5 years. significantly older than single or married suicides. Widowed individuals often lived in isolation, facing physical ailments, depression, and poverty, especially women who had fewer employment opportunities. Men, however, were more likely to commit suicide after becoming widowed. In Geneva, men made up a slight majority of widowed suicides, but because they constituted only about a fourth of the widowed population, their propensity to commit suicide was more than 3 times greater than that of widows. This suggests that men found it particularly difficult to cope with the loss of a spouse, possibly due to a lack of domestic skills and the physical vulnerabilities that come with age. As we explore the dark side of love and family in early modern Geneva, we uncover a complex tapestry of social, economic, and cultural factors that contributed to the rise in suicides. The story of Antoinette Martin is just one thread in this intricate web, a reminder of the human toll of these pressures and the need to understand them deeply. During the early modern period, the numbers of suicides by marital status changed quite a bit. In the first half of the 1700s, unmarried people were more likely to take their own lives compared to married people. But if we look back to the period from 1542 to 1700, we see that more married people, especially men, were among those who committed suicide. For example, out of 29 male suicides, 17 were married, and about 43.5% of female suicides were married. This shift in suicide rates among different marital statuses is puzzling. One might think that fewer people were getting married in the 1700s, but that wasn't the case. In fact, the average age at which people got married only increased a little bit. Men went from marrying at around 27.9 years old in the 1600s to 29.2 years old in the 1700s, and women went from 25.6 to 27.9. This small change in age wouldn't explain the big drop in the number of married people among suicides. Interestingly, the percentage of married people in Geneva's population actually increased from 31.9% in 1720 to 36.2% in 1798. This was partly because fewer people were staying single their whole lives. Fewer children meant parents could better afford to set up their kids with apprenticeships and dowries, making it easier for them to get married. Despite these trends, married people were less likely to commit suicide in the 1700s. This raises the question, why were single people more likely to take their own lives? One possible explanation is something called matrimonial selection. Not everyone who wants to get married can. People who are sick, poor, or mentally unstable often have a hard time finding a partner. These people might also be more likely to have other problems, like a higher risk of suicide. For example, Jean Dittmar, a 29-year-old watchmaker, shot himself in 1772. He had castrated himself years earlier to avoid the temptations of the flesh and the desire to marry. Dittmar was clearly mentally unstable, and his castration made it unlikely he would ever marry. Another case involves Jean-Philippe Roux, a 33-year-old man who hanged himself in 1769. He had been in a mental hospital for a year before his suicide, and he had tried to kill himself before. Marie-Anne Molinier, a 26-year-old woman, drowned herself in 1790. Her mother had been insane, and Molinier herself had been institutionalized for her erratic behavior. Jean Robert Baudelet, a 27-year-old watchmaker, shot himself in 1789. He was described as feeble-minded, couldn't read or write, and believed his limp prevented him from finding a wife. All these people had mental or physical issues that made it hard for them to marry. However, Being single didn't mean you were automatically more likely to be unstable. Pierre Pleck, a 79-year-old widower, drowned himself in 1763. He had been eccentric and poor, but he had managed to marry earlier in life. Jean Bouvard, a vinegar maker, was married and had a normal life until he started having delusions and hallucinations. He jumped into the Rhone in 1789. These examples show that mental issues could develop after marriage, not just before. So, if being married didn't just mean you were more stable, what was it about marriage that protected people from suicide? One idea is that marriage and family became more emotionally important in the 1700s. People started investing more in the emotional side of marriage, which offered more support and protection against suicide. Between 1751 and 1798, over a quarter of suicides were related to family issues, like losing a loved one, domestic disputes, or romantic problems. Before 1700, family issues were rarely a reason for suicide. In the 1700s, more people expected their marriages to be based on love and companionship. This meant that those who couldn't find love or get married might feel more emotionally unfulfilled and at risk of suicide. For example, Samuel Pellet, a 30-year-old haberdasher, married Catherine Pansy in 1734, despite his parents' disapproval. After telling his mother about the marriage, she became furious and slapped him. Catherine, devastated by this reaction, threw herself into the Rhone the next day, ending their marriage after just one day. In the latter half of the 1700s, love and romance became even more important. Jean Renée Dunant, a 49-year-old woman, drowned herself in 1757 after a failed love affair. Louis Marsens, a 36-year-old watchmaker, shot himself in 1779 because of two failed romances, one with a woman in a Catholic nunnery. Christine Scherf, a 24-year-old woman, jumped into the Rhone in 1785 after her fiancé criticized her behavior and said he wouldn't marry her unless she changed. Sometimes the emotional intensity of romantic relationships could even lead to double suicides. Pierre Adam Ray, a carpenter, and Jean Beauvais, a servant, were in a bigamous marriage. Ray was already married to another woman, and when his family threatened to expose their relationship, they both jumped into the Rhone in 1780. All these stories show that the emotional depth of marriage and family relationships in the 1700s played a significant role in whether people were more or less likely to commit suicide. As marriage became more about love and companionship, it offered more emotional support, which helped protect people from the despair that could lead to suicide. Jean Pernette d'Illeville and Abraham de Fernax were two young lovers who, in June 1782, decided to end their lives in a way that mirrored the tragic story of Romeo and Juliet. They were both 23 and deeply in love, but their relationship faced obstacles from both of their fathers. Jean and Abraham often had heated arguments over small things, always feeling that their love was at stake in even the tiniest disagreements. Abraham was devastated when Jean's father hinted that Jean might not be as keen on the marriage as Abraham was. He wrote her a heartbroken note, saying that he loved her more than ever but wondered what good it was to get her family's approval if he couldn't win her heart. Jean, already feeling the weight of the conflict, took a large dose of opium and died the next day. Abraham, unaware of her death, arrived at her home and was inconsolable when he found out. He hugged and kissed her lifeless body, and later that same day he took his own life by shooting himself, leaving a note to his father that said, "Father, this is the last sorrow I will cause you." This tragic story shows that even though the idea of marrying for love was becoming more common, parental consent was still crucial. In 1793, Matthew Jourdain, a 24-year-old soldier, shot himself in front of his parents' house because his mother opposed his marriage. This shows that even as the idea of companionate marriage was growing, the influence of parents remained strong. Another sad story involves Pierre-François Varlet, a 40-year-old actor from Paris. Varlet had been in a 5-year love affair with the daughter of Jean Samuel Muller, a dance instructor. Muller initially refused to let Varlet marry his daughter because he didn't want her following the life of a theater troupe. After Varlet promised to give up acting, Muller agreed, and they planned to marry around Easter, 1791. Varlet was deeply in love and spent many evenings at the Muller household. However, Varlet had a secret. He had been involved with another woman in Lyon and even had a child with her. When he feared this affair would be exposed and ruin his chances with Muller's daughter, he drowned himself in November 1790. His fiancée was devastated, and it became clear that the fear of losing her was what drove him to take his own life. These stories highlight the complex emotions and pressures surrounding love and marriage in the late 18th century. As the idea of marrying for love became more popular, the stakes of romantic relationships grew higher. People began to see love as a sublime reason for living or even dying, as expressed by Madame de Staël in 1796. The influence of literature also played a role in these tragic events. In 1779, Ami Patti, a 19-year-old watchmaker, read Johann Wolfgang von Goethe's The Sorrows of Young Werther, and was inspired to take his own life. He visited a widow, Jacqueline Brodon, and showed her the book before going to his workshop and shooting himself in the head. Beside his body, they found the French translation of Werther. In 1783, Etienne Pestre, another 19-year-old, also took his life after reading Werther. He had been reading the novel on the job and spoke to his cousin about a man who had recently drowned himself. He went to bed with the book, and the next morning his body was found with a gunshot wound to the head and a blood-splattered copy of Werther nearby. André de la Rue, an 18-year-old watchmaker, was the third young man inspired by Werther. He had an unhappy love affair and a melancholic personality. He was found dead by poisoning, and witnesses mentioned that he had read Werther and other similar novels. As romantic love became more important, loveless marriages became less tolerable. Between 1750 and the end of the century, 13 Genevans committed suicide because of unfulfilling marriages. Pierre Dombre, a watchmaker, shot himself in 1787. He was unemployed and separated from his wife, who had left him for another man. He was also in love with a married woman who rejected him. In a letter, he wrote about his hopelessness and how he wanted to die at her feet. John Bertrand, a wine seller, shot himself in 1792 because his wife had left him 2 weeks earlier. Jean-Alexandre Fontaine, a watchmaker, shot himself in 1777 after his recent divorce. He had tried to kill himself before by stabbing himself and was the only person in early modern Geneva to take his life directly because of a divorce. Antoinette Jacquet, a seamstress, jumped to her death in 1778. She was upset by her husband's affair and his unkind treatment. Despite her forgiveness, he suggested they separate, which led to her suicide. Dame Antoinette Martin, a French noblewoman, took her life in 1759 because she was unhappy in her marriage. She had married beneath her station and found her husband, a surgeon, to be kind but boring. She had developed a strong interest in a younger man before and after her marriage, and her husband was jealous, Although she respected her husband, she felt emotionally unfulfilled and regretted her marriage of convenience. These stories show that the growing importance of the companionate marriage could have both positive and negative effects. Some single people who failed at love took their lives, while some married people committed suicide because their marriages were unhappy. However, for those in miserable marriages, divorce became a more viable option. The number of divorces increased, reflecting the desire for personal fulfillment and the growing emphasis on individualism. Divorce and separation, while not the main cause of the increase in suicides, were alternative ways to deal with unhappy marriages. As Emile Durkheim noted, the suicide rate is higher for divorces, as divorce represents a breakdown in social norms. While the number of suicides who were divorced or separated was small, the overall trend shows that people were increasingly prioritizing their personal happiness over societal expectations. This shift in mentality indicates that the Republic of Geneva was becoming a less tightly integrated society, with individuals placing more importance on their own well-being. In the late 1700s, families in Geneva faced new challenges. People started to value their individual lives more, and this often led to conflicts between different generations. For example, older parents sometimes felt neglected by their grown children, who wanted more privacy and independence. This tension was so strong that it even led to some tragic outcomes, like suicide. One such case involved Isaac Jar, a married man who shot himself in 1629. He had been feeling sad for a year, especially about his 18-year-old daughter's marriage engagement. Another example was Isaac de Kernix, an 86-year-old widower who drowned himself in 1778. He had been living in a hospital for a year, and some fellow inmates said he was upset because his son and daughter-in-law didn't want to take him in. These kinds of conflicts often involved poorer men who felt their children were not helping them enough. For instance, René Avial, a 60-year-old man whose wife was in prison, drowned himself in 1792. He had been sick and was living with a landlady who suggested he go to the hospital. Avial was upset by this and hinted that he would commit suicide. When the landlady talked to Avilal's eldest son for help, the son coldly replied that he didn't care what happened to his father. Avial took his life a few days later, and witnesses said his children had neglected him. However, it's not always clear if the children were to blame. In Avilal's case, his son denied being neglectful and claimed he had often helped his father. He also mentioned that his parents had a history of running a house of prostitution, which had alienated him from them. Another case involved Jean Martin, whose father, Isaac Martin, drowned himself in 1786. Jean, a young seamstress, probably couldn't offer much financial help to her father, who was already bitter. The court records show that in many of these cases the children were married and preferred not to take their elderly parents into their homes. This desire for independence and privacy was more common in the late 1700s. For example, Jean-Pierre de Kernix, the son of the 86-year-old widower who drowned, had placed his father in a hospital, paid for his keep, and provided him with spending money. The father even visited his son's family every week, and they washed his laundry for him. The magistrates didn't disapprove of this arrangement, recognizing the younger couple's need for privacy. Interestingly, all the older parents who committed suicide because they felt abandoned were men. This might be because fathers traditionally had more authority in the household, and young couples feared that living with their fathers would mean having to take orders from them. Mothers, on the other hand, were less of a threat in this regard. Generational conflicts also affected younger people. 12 young people, mostly men, took their lives after disputes with their parents. For example, Philippe Brun, a 14-year-old, hanged himself in 1753 after his father had him imprisoned for his libertine behavior. The young Brun had been crying in his cell and begging to see his mother, but his request was denied. Another young man, Etienne, shot himself in 1793 after writing a letter to his father. He was upset because his parents opposed his marriage. These suicides reflect the tension between young people's desire for independence and their parents' efforts to control their lives. The growing importance of romantic love as a reason for marriage sometimes clashed with parents' wishes for advantageous matches. The emotional bonds within the nuclear family also became stronger, making family dysfunction more intolerable. Grief over the loss of a family member was another common reason for suicide. 23 people, including both men and women, took their lives out of grief. For example, Louis Etienne de Tremblay, a watchmaker's son, jumped to his death in 1780 after the loss of his sister. François Desarts, the son of a prestigious political figure, shot himself in 1754 after his father's death. Jean-Jacques Denel, a 15-year-old apprentice, drowned himself in 1777, 3 months after his father died. The death of a spouse or fiancé was also a frequent motive. Daniel Dupress, a blacksmith, drowned himself in 1779, 5 weeks after his wife died. Jean-Louis Diffenot, a 75-year-old carpenter, committed suicide hours after his wife passed away. Guillaume Louis Reinhardt, an apothecary, shot himself in 1781 after the death of his fiancée, whom he blamed for her pregnancy and subsequent death. While the loss of a child was not a common motive for suicide, it did happen. Pernette Refet hanged herself in 1772 because her husband was terminally ill, and she had already lost a child the previous year. Louise Guy, a 38-year-old mother, jumped to her death in 1724 after the loss of a child. John Louis Liana, a widower, committed suicide in 1747 after his son took his own life and his daughter was about to get married. Despite the emotional impact of losing a child, Genevan parents generally managed to cope with this grief. Only 6 times in 250 years did the death of a child lead to suicide, and usually there were additional factors involved. Parenthood itself was sometimes a deterrent to suicide, as suggested by sociologists like Durkheim. However, the evidence from Geneva is mixed. While some parents, especially mothers, were deterred by concerns for their children, others found that the death of a child increased their risk of suicide. The baptism and death records provide valuable insights into the family dynamics and the impact of parenthood on suicide, though there are some gaps in the data, especially for foreigners. Overall, the late 1700s in Geneva saw a shift in family dynamics, with individualism and the desire for privacy leading to new tensions and sometimes tragic outcomes. In the early modern period, Geneva, a city with a rich history, was a place where the lives and deaths of its people were closely documented. One of the most intriguing aspects of these records is the information about the parental status of those who committed suicide. Despite the detailed records, we don't have all the answers, but we do have some interesting insights. Among the people who took their own lives, both fathers and mothers were in the minority. This means that most of the people who committed suicide did not have children who survived them. This pattern was the same for both men and women. If we exclude those whose parental status is unknown, only about 40% of the suicides had children who lived after them. It would be helpful to compare these numbers with the general population of Geneva, but unfortunately, such detailed information doesn't exist. However, we do know that in Geneva, Between the late 1600s and the late 1700s, about 12.5 to 16.9% of married couples had no children at all. These numbers only account for couples who never had a birth. They don't include those whose children didn't survive. When we look at the married people who committed suicide, very few of them left no children. Out of 92 married men who took their own lives, only 16 had no children. If we exclude the 8 whose status is unknown, only 19% of the married male suicides had no children. This percentage is almost the same after 1750. Out of 64 married males' suicides, only 18.8%, had no children, excluding the 2 whose status is unknown. For married women, the numbers are similar. Out of 42 married women who committed suicide, only 5 definitely had no children, and for 8, it's unknown if they had any children. If we exclude the 8, only 14.7% of the married female suicides had no children. Surprisingly, after 1750, this number dropped even further. Out of 21 married female suicides, only 2, 9.5%, had no children, excluding the 4 whose status is unknown. This data contradicts what Emil Durkheim, a famous sociologist, believed. Durkheim thought that motherhood provided more protection against suicide than just being married. If this were true, we would expect to see more childless women among the suicides. However, the reality is different. After 1750, married women with children were slightly more likely to commit suicide than those without children. For men, the numbers are roughly in line with the percentage of childless families in Geneva. The age of the children also matters. Having young children might be a bigger deterrent to suicide than having adult children. According to the records, out of 142 suicides who left children, 81, 55 men and 26 women had children under the age of 13, while 49, 35 men and 14 women had only adult children. This means that there were more suicides with young children than with only adult children. In a society with late marriages and high mortality rates, it's likely that there were more parents with young children than with adult children. This suggests that having young children provided more protection against suicide than having adult children. When we look at the overall numbers, women made up about 31.9% of all suicides and 29.6% of those who left children. This ratio remained consistent, regardless of the age of the children. After 1750, women made up 27.1% of all suicides, 26.3% of those who left children, and 29% of those who left children under 13. However, for those who left no children, women made up only 24.8% of the suicides. This suggests that being childless might have provided more protection against suicide for women than having children. Men with dependents were more likely to commit suicide because of poverty. Out of 25 men who committed suicide due to poverty, 8 were single, 9 were married, 3 were widowers, and 3 were separated. This means that bachelors who made up 45.9% of all suicides, whose marital status was known, only made up 34.8% of those who committed suicide because of poverty. Having a family to support could push a person into poverty, and the emotional distress of seeing one's family suffer could be overwhelming. For example, Jean Huguenin, a 43-year-old artisan, jumped to his death from his 5th-story apartment because he couldn't support his wife and 3 children. He had lost his tools and furniture to creditors and felt desperate. Similarly, John Mark Kempery, a 35-year-old former baker, shot himself after trying to support his wife and 4 young children by making silk ornaments. He wrote a letter to his family, explaining that he couldn't bear to see them suffer. These cases show that men who were married and had dependent children were more likely to commit suicide because of poverty. Married women, whose labor was meant to supplement their husband's income, felt less guilty if their family was poor. Family issues such as the death of a loved one, romantic problems, marital breakdowns, and unwanted pregnancies also led to suicides. Out of 89 suicides motivated by family issues, 61 were men and 28 were women. This means that men made up the majority of these suicides. This suggests that both men and women were equally affected by personal and family problems. These family issues also crossed class lines. After 1750, the wealthy were slightly underrepresented among suicides motivated by family issues, while the poor were overrepresented. The majority of these suicides were from the artisan class, especially watchmakers. Only a few merchants and unskilled laborers committed suicide because of family issues. This suggests that the emphasis on romantic love and family ties was not limited to one social class. Even though the wealthy had more resources, they still faced the emotional strains of family life. The growing importance of romantic love and emotional bonds within the family was a trend that affected people from all walks of life in Geneva. In the late 1700s, Geneva, a small city in Switzerland, went through a quiet but significant change in how people thought about marriage and family. This change had a big impact on the number of suicides in the city. During this time, the idea of a companionate marriage became very popular. This meant that people started to believe that marriage should be based on mutual love and affection, not just on economic or social reasons. Men and women from all walks of life, merchants, servants, and artisans, started to think that a happy marriage was one where both partners loved and cared for each other deeply. This shift in thinking about marriage had some interesting effects. For one, the number of married people who committed suicide decreased after 1750. This suggests that more people found satisfaction and happiness in their marriages. On the other hand, the number of widowed people who committed suicide increased. This was because the end of a marriage, especially one based on deep love, left a much bigger emotional void. The change in attitudes toward marriage didn't happen in a vacuum. Geneva was going through a lot of changes during this period. The city was facing economic and political turmoil, especially in the 1780s and 1790s. The peak year for suicides in Geneva was right after the end of the old regime in December 1792, a time when the city's government and social structures were in flux. Despite these broader issues, the family and marriage still played a significant role in the rise of suicides. For example, studies have shown that people who were single or widowed had much higher suicide rates compared to those who were married. This trend was true not just in Geneva, but in other places as well, like Victorian England. Another interesting aspect of this period was the type of suicides that were common. In Geneva, suicides that resembled the fictional character Werther from Goethe's novel were more frequent than those inspired by the ancient Roman figure Cato. Werther's story was about unrequited love and emotional distress, while Cato's was about honor and duty. This suggests that emotional and personal issues were becoming more important reasons for suicide. The legal and social changes also reflected these new attitudes. For instance, the age at which people could marry without parental consent increased over time, reflecting a growing respect for individual choice. Divorce laws became more lenient, and the number of divorces increased, especially in the latter half of the 18th century. This showed that people were more willing to end unhappy marriages, which was a significant shift from earlier times when divorce was rare and often stigmatized. However, it's important to note that not all suicides were related to marriage or family issues. Some people took their lives because of economic hardships, political turmoil, or personal mental health issues. For example, some individuals who committed suicide were dealing with deep feelings of melancholy or depression, which were not directly related to their marital status. In some cases, social pressures and public humiliation could also lead to suicide. For instance, a woman named Sarah Garnier, who lived in a small village near Geneva, took her own life after being publicly humiliated by her neighbors. She had a violent argument with her husband, and the community organized a charivari, a form of public shaming, which she found too much to bear. Overall, the late 18th century in Geneva was a time of significant change in how people thought about love, marriage, and family. These changes, along with broader social and economic factors, contributed to the rise in suicides. While the family and marriage were important, they were not the only reasons for this trend. The period was one of transition, where old ways of thinking were giving way to new, more individualistic and emotionally driven values. In the city of Geneva, during the Reformation, people strongly believed that suicide was connected to the devil. They thought that when someone took their own life, it was because the devil had taken control of their mind. This belief was so common that even those who committed suicide sometimes thought the devil was behind their actions. For example, in 1555, a farmer named Jean Jourdain was very upset. He had a venereal disease, felt guilty about passing it to his sister, and was worried about appearing before a church court for his sins. Instead of going to church one Sunday, Jourdain went into the woods and stabbed himself. After he did this, he heard the church bell ringing and felt very sorry for what he had done. He asked God for forgiveness and asked people to help him. While he was dying, he said he had called out to the devil to kill him, but the devil didn't come to his aid. Another case involved a man named Père Bouloz in 1547. Bouloz was accused of witchcraft and was being questioned by the authorities. He was tortured, but he refused to confess. After one of the torture sessions, he managed to get a knife and stabbed himself 5 times, dying a few hours later. Before he died, he asked God for mercy and shouted, "Devil, get away from me." Even though he denied being a witch, he still thought the devil was involved in his suicide. In 1564, a woman named Julienne Berard jumped into the Rhone River. People said she was afraid of going before the church court. Some even said she was a witch and that the devil had spoken to her servant girl, who was later executed for witchcraft. This made people think that the devil might have been behind Berard's suicide as well. Even when people thought mental illness might be the reason for suicide, they still believed it was linked to the devil. In those times, many religious leaders, both Protestant and Catholic, thought that being sad or mentally ill was a sign that the devil was controlling someone. For example, Timothy Bright, who wrote a book about sadness in 1586, said that suicide was caused by the devil tempting people or by God's judgment. Nehemiah Wowington, a man who tried to kill himself several times in the early 1600s, believed his sadness came from the devil, who appeared to him in different forms. Richard Napier, a doctor in the 1600s, also wrote about people who tried to kill themselves because they thought the devil was tempting them. People believed that if you were sad or alone, the devil could more easily control you. A Benedictine monk named Wolfgang Seidel wrote that being sad was the devil's best way to destroy someone's faith. He suggested that people should stay busy, pray, read the Bible, and take care of themselves to avoid the devil's influence. During the Reformation, many people, both religious leaders and ordinary folks, believed that the devil was more powerful and dangerous than ever before. This belief led to an increase in the number of people who were diagnosed with mental illnesses like sadness or despair. In the 1500s, there were more stories about people who thought they were possessed by the devil. Some scholars think that this increase in mental illness and suicide was because of the strong religious messages of the time. Both Protestant and Catholic preachers were warning people about sin, damnation, and the devil's power. This made many people, not just monks and nuns, feel very afraid and hopeless. In 1625, a wealthy woman named Elizabeth Taskell became very mentally unstable. She said she felt possessed by demons and became violent, swearing at and even biting the people around her. A few days before her death, she told her niece that the devil wanted her to kill herself. One night, after reading the Bible, Pascal jumped out of a window to her death, despite her niece and chambermaid trying to stop her. Pascal and her husband had been arguing about money, but her husband did try to comfort her by talking to her about God and asking her to pray. These stories show how strongly people in Reformation Geneva believed that the devil was behind suicide. Disbelief was a big part of their understanding of why people took their own lives. In this chapter, we explore a fascinating aspect of life in Reformation Geneva, the relationship between religion, mental health, and suicide. We see how deeply faith and the fear of the devil influenced people's lives and decisions, especially in times of distress. Let's start with the story of Dr. Dauphin, a physician who visited a woman named Pascal. Dr. Dauphin believed that Pascal's depression was caused by her domestic problems, and he encouraged her to find healing through both medicine and faith. Over time, his visits became more like spiritual counseling. He prayed with her and urged her to think of God. Pascal also believed that the devil was trying to prevent her from praying, which shows how the fear of diabolical influence was a significant part of her life. Another tragic story is that of Marie Chiocchio, a wife who became extremely upset when she heard that her child was bewitched. While helping her husband in his shop, she excused herself to give instructions to their servant. However, the servant had left to fetch water, and Chiocchio jumped from a high window crying out her child's name. This shows how the fear of diabolical possession was so intense that it could lead to desperate actions. Religion played a crucial role in the daily lives of Genevans. Jean Mermaud, a pastry cook, was known for his religious devotions. Despite suffering from mental health issues, he attended church and led morning prayers with his son. Tragically, he took his own life one morning after a period of joy following a church service. Similarly, Jacques Ribumier, a wealthy jewelry merchant, was a regular churchgoer who read the Bible daily. One Friday, he attended morning and afternoon church services. After reading the Bible in the afternoon, he shot himself in the head. This shows that even devout religious practices did not always prevent suicide. The story of Madeleine Serrao, a goldsmith's wife, further illustrates the complex relationship between faith and mental health. She actively participated in family devotions and prayed with her husband and son. On the night before her death, she expressed deep guilt and fear of God, ultimately jumping from her window. This might seem to suggest that the strictness of Reformed faith could lead to feelings of guilt and desperation. However, there is no evidence that the doctrine of predestination, a key tenet of Calvinism, was a significant source of anxiety for most Genevans. Historian Robert Kingdon's research shows that for the average person in Geneva, religion was more about rituals and daily practices than deep theological debates. The fear of a judgmental God and the belief that the devil could cause suicide were powerful deterrents against self-harm. despite the strong influence of religion, suicide remained relatively rare in Geneva during the 16th and 17th centuries. By the end of the 17th century, the belief that the devil caused suicide began to fade. Instead, people like François Cartier and François Dunand, who took their lives due to illness, were seen as victims of their physical and mental conditions rather than diabolical influence. Their pastors argued that their actions were not a result of sin or rebellion against God, but rather a consequence of their illnesses. In Reformation Geneva, the church and society were tightly integrated. The consistory, an institution that enforced moral behavior, played a significant role in people's lives. It monitored and disciplined residents, reinforcing the community's strong sense of religious and social order. This tight integration rather than individualism was a key factor in preventing suicide. In summary, the evidence from Reformation Geneva shows that while religion and the fear of the devil played a significant role in people's lives, they also served as powerful deterrents against suicide. The tight-knit community and the strong influence of the church helped maintain a low rate of self-inflicted deaths. This challenges the idea that Reformed Protestantism, with its emphasis on a judgmental God, necessarily led to increased feelings of despair and suicide. Instead, it suggests that the religious and social structures of Reformation Geneva provided a strong support system that helped prevent such tragic outcomes